The wind had teeth, and it bit at the raw skin of Clara Dalton's face. It was a scavenger's wind, sweeping across the endless iron-hard plains of Kansas, promising nothing but a colder grave. Each step was a splinter of glass in her lungs. She ran, not with the grace of a deer, but with the stumbling, frantic gait of a wounded coyote, glancing over her shoulder at a horizon that was as empty and hostile as the men she imagined were still riding just beyond it. Her dress, a cheap thing of satin the color of a fading bruise, was torn at the hem and stained with mud and something darker she refused to name. It was not her dress. Nothing she had worn for the past 6 months had been hers. The thin slippers were shredded, her feet numb and bleeding inside them. She had scrambled over rocks and through thorny brush, propelled by a fear so pure it had burned away every other sensation. Now, exhaustion was setting in, a thick, sweet poison flooding her veins. She had escaped. The word was a fragile prayer on her chapped lips. She had waited for the night when the whiskey flowed too freely, when the man they called her keeper had passed out in his chair, his fat jaw slack and his keys hanging from a hook by the door. She had taken nothing but the clothes on her back and the one thing she had managed to keep hidden, tucked into the bodice of her corset for all those terrible months. The letter. It was a crinkled, sweat-stained ghost against her skin, its edges soft as old linen. The plane offered no cover, just waves of dead grass shivering in the wind and the occasional, skeletal form of a yucca plant. Her vision blurred. The vast, gray sky pressed down, and the ground seemed to rise up to meet her. She saw a shape in the distance, a dark smudge against the endless brown. It was not a rider. It was low to the ground, solid, a rock, maybe, or something more. Hope, thin and desperate, flickered in her chest. She forced her legs to move, one after the other, a dead march toward the vague promise of shelter. It was a cabin, or what was left of one, an old trapper's shack, by the look of it. The roof was a patchwork of sod and rotted timber, slumped in the middle like a broken back. The door hung from a single leather hinge, creaking a lonely complaint with every gust of wind. No smoke rose from the mud and stick chimney. It was abandoned, a hollowed-out skull on the prairie. It was perfect. Clara stumbled through the doorway, her shoulder catching on the splintered frame. The inside smelled of dust, decay, and the faint, musky scent of animals that had taken refuge from storms long past. A single room, a dirt floor, a stone hearth black with ancient soot. In one corner lay a pile of dry leaves and filthy rags, a rat's nest or a drifter's bed. She did not care. She fell into it, the last of her strength leaving her in a ragged sigh. The world dissolved into a merciful blackness, the sound of the wind her only lullaby. She was safe. For now. The thought was a dream she had as she slipped into a sleep too deep for nightmares. The men from that house in Wichita would not find her here. They would ride the main trails, check the towns. They would never think to look for her in a place so thoroughly forgotten by God. Eli Carver rode with his head bent against the wind, his hat pulled low. The sky had turned the color of a fresh bruise, a heavy, purple-gray that swallowed the horizon. A norther was coming, fast and mean. His horse, a sturdy buckskin named Gideon, shifted nervously beneath him, its ears twitching. Eli patted the animal's neck, his gloved hand resting for a moment on the coarse mane. He could feel the change in the air, the electric tension that came before a prairie storm. It was a deep, bone-aching cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. Tied behind his saddle was a small, tightly wrapped bundle of oilcloth. Inside was a simple pine box, no bigger than a loaf of bread, containing what was left of his younger brother, Jacob. Ash and bone fragments, gathered from the scorched earth where the rustlers had left him. Eli had been trailing them for 2 months. A cold, patient fury, his only companion. He had found them 2 weeks ago, and he had done what he felt he must. Now, all that was left was the promise he'd made to his mother years ago, to bring her boys home, no matter what. He was taking Jacob back to the small, dried-up patch of family land in Missouri to be buried beside her. He was not a man given to prayer, but he sent a silent request into the darkening sky for shelter. He had no desire to be caught in the open when the storm broke. It would be a blizzard, most likely, the kind that could freeze a man solid in his saddle. As if in answer, he saw it, a faint, dark shape, hunkered low against the land, barely visible in the fading light. A shack. It was not much, but it was better than nothing. He urged Gideon forward, the horse picking its way carefully over the uneven ground. The shack looked derelict, a place of last resort. As he drew closer, he saw the door was ajar, swinging loose. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the dry, cold earth. He moved slowly, his hand resting near the butt of the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. The West had taught him that an empty place was rarely ever truly empty. He nudged the door open with his foot and peered into the gloom. At first, he saw nothing but shadows. Then his eyes adjusted, and he made out a shape in the corner. A person, curled into a heap of rags. He stayed in the doorway, his body a dark silhouette against the stormy sky. "Hello?" he called out, his voice low and calm, not wanting to startle whoever was inside. The heap of rags moved. It sat up, slowly, and he could see it was a woman. Her hair was a wild tangle of red, matted with dirt and leaves. Her face was a pale oval in the darkness, smudged with grime, her eyes wide with a terror that was almost feral. One side of her face was swollen and dark with a vicious bruise that trailed down her neck. She scrambled backward, crab-like, until her back hit the rough timber wall. "Stay back," she hissed, her voice a dry, rasping thing. Eli held up his hands, palms open, showing he meant no harm. "Easy now. I am just looking for shelter from the storm." He kept his voice even, gentle. He had calmed spooked horses with less care. "I will not hurt you." Her eyes darted around the small cabin, searching for something. Her hand closed around the neck of a broken bottle half buried in the dirt. She raised it. The jagged edge pointed at him. It was a poor weapon, but she held it with a desperate conviction. "I said stay back," she repeated, her knuckles white around the glass. Eli looked at her, truly looked at her then. The cheap, torn dress, the bruises, the raw fear in her eyes was not just of him, a stranger, but of something deeper, something that had been chasing her for a long time. He recognized the look of a cornered animal, one that would fight to the death because it believed death was coming anyway. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "All right." He took a step back, out of the doorway, raising his hands a little higher. "The cabin is yours. I will wait out here." He could see the confusion flicker in her eyes, a brief crack in the armor of her terror. She had expected him to rush her, to fight her, to take what he wanted. His quiet compliance was something she could not understand. He turned his back on her, a gesture of trust he hoped she would recognize, and walked back to his horse. The first flakes of snow began to fall, tiny and sharp, stinging his cheeks. He unsaddled Gideon, rubbing the horse down with a coarse blanket from his bedroll. He tied the reins to a rotted fence post nearby, giving the animal enough slack to lower its head. From his saddlebags, he pulled out a small sack of oats and poured them onto the ground for the horse. Then, he turned his attention to his own needs. He had a small supply of jerky, some hardtack, and a canteen of water. Not much, but it would have to do. He found a spot on the leeward side of the cabin, sheltered from the worst of the wind, and sat down with his back against the cold wall. The snow was falling faster now, a thick, white curtain descending over the prairie. He pulled his sheepskin collar up around his neck and settled in to wait. He could hear the wind howling around the corners of the shack, a mournful, lonely sound. He wondered about the woman inside, who she was, where she had come from, and what horrors had put that look in her eyes. He had seen men in the war look less haunted. Inside the cabin, Clara watched him through a crack in the wall. She saw him tend to his horse, his movements economical and sure. She saw him sit down in the snow, his broad back to her, seemingly unconcerned with the worsening storm. It made no sense. Men did not behave this way. The men she had known took what they wanted. They did not ask permission, and they certainly did not offer kindness to a woman who looked like she had crawled out of a ditch. Her stomach cramped with a hunger so sharp it felt like a knife wound. She had not eaten in 2 days. The smell of the snow, clean and cold, made her mouth water. The man was still out there. She could see his dark shape through the swirling flakes. He was a big man, his shoulders wide even under the heavy coat. He would be strong. He could break her with his bare hands. Yet, he sat in a blizzard while she had the shelter of 4 walls. An hour passed, then another. The initial rush of adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a deep, aching cold and a gnawing emptiness in her belly. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her gut, but it was now competing with a more immediate and primal need. She was starving, and she was freezing. The rags she lay on offered little warmth, and the wind found its way through 100 cracks in the cabin walls. She saw the man stand up and walk back toward the door. Her heart leaped into her throat. She gripped the broken bottle tighter, her hand trembling. He stopped a few feet from the entrance. "Ma'am," his voice carried over the wind. "I have some food and a fire starter. It is getting too cold out here for man or beast." He paused. "I could leave them by the door for you, if you like." He waited. Clara said nothing. Her breath caught in her chest. "I will not come in unless you say I can," he added. "You have my word." She watched as he knelt down and placed a small, cloth-wrapped package on the ground just outside the threshold. Next to it, he set a small tin box. Then, without another word, he retreated to his spot against the wall. Clara stared at the offerings. Food, fire, warmth, life. All she had to do was open the door. But opening the door meant letting him see her weakness. It meant trusting the word of a man. And trust was a currency she no longer possessed. She waited, watching him, trying to find a lies in the steady set of his shoulders, in the patient way he sat in the deepening snow. Finally, the gnawing in her stomach won. Slowly, painfully, she crawled to the door. Her limbs were stiff with cold and fear. She peered out. The package and the tin were still there. The man had not moved. With a shaking hand, she reached out and snatched them from the ground, dragging them inside and pushing the heavy door shut. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she fumbled with the cloth. Inside was a strip of dried meat and 2 biscuits of hardtack. It was the plainest meal she had ever seen, and it looked like a king's feast. She devoured the jerky, the tough, salty meat a shock to her system. She saved the hardtack, knowing it would last. Then she opened the tin. Inside were matches and a small block of tinder. She looked toward the hearth. If she could make a fire, she could survive the night. She could get warm, but a fire would be an invitation. The light would spill from the cracks in the walls. It would show him she was still here, still alive. Still a woman, alone. The cold made the decision for her. Her fingers were numb, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. She crawled to the hearth, scraped together some stray bits of wood and dried moss from the corners of the cabin, and struck a match. The flame sputtered, then caught. A small, hungry fire began to lick at the kindling, casting a flickering, golden light across the squalid room. The warmth was immediate, glorious. It seeped into her bones, thawing the ice that had settled deep in her marrow. She huddled close to the flames, mesmerized by their dance. And in that warmth, a terrible, profound loneliness washed over her. She was alive, but she was utterly alone. Outside, Eli saw the flicker of light. A small smile touched his lips. A rare thing for him these days. At least she would not freeze. He pulled his blanket tighter around himself, the snow collecting on his hat and shoulders, and prepared to endure the night. The storm raged for hours. Clara did not sleep. She sat by the fire, the broken bottle in her lap, and listened to the howl of the wind. Every creak of the old cabin made her jump. But the man did not move. He did not try the door. He did not call out to her. He simply sat outside, a silent, unmoving guardian in the storm. As dawn approached, the wind began to die down. The snow stopped. A strange, heavy silence fell over the world. Clara felt a shift inside her. The fear was still there, but it was no longer a frantic, screaming thing. It was a low, steady hum. The man had kept his word. He had given her food and the means for warmth, and he had asked for nothing in return. He had respected her fear, her space. She was still weak, too weak to travel far on her own. The prairie was a white, trackless wasteland. She would not last a day out there alone. She needed help, and the only help available was sitting just outside her door. Taking a deep breath that felt like swallowing stones, she stood up and walked to the door. She opened it. The morning light was pale and blue on the fresh snow. The man was on his feet, brushing snow from his coat. He looked tired, his face etched with lines of weariness. But his eyes, when they met hers, were clear and steady. They were a calm gray, like the sky after a storm. He did not speak, just waited. She was the one who broke the silence, her voice small and rough from disuse. You can come in, if you wish." Eli nodded slowly. He walked past her into the small cabin, bringing the cold air in with him. He moved to the fire and held his raw, red hands out to the flames. The small room was suddenly crowded, filled with his presence. He was bigger up close, and the scent of leather, snow, and something else, something like pine and cold earth, clung to him. Clara retreated to the far wall, clutching her arms around herself. The distrust was a physical thing, a wall she had built brick by painful brick. It did not fall just because she had opened a door. They stood in silence for a long time, the only sound the crackle of the fire. The land outside the door was brutal, wind-burnt hills, now covered in a pristine blanket of white, hid gullies and rocks. The rotting fences that marked some long-forgotten claim were almost completely buried. It was a beautiful and terrible landscape, one that did not suffer fools or the unprepared. Finally, Eli spoke, his voice low and rumbling. "I am heading east, toward Ridgefield. It is a few days' ride from here." He glanced at her, not with pity, but with a kind of practical assessment. "You are in no shape to travel alone. I can take you with me. There is a doctor there, a sheriff." Clara flinched at the word sheriff. The law had never been her friend. She looked down at her hands, at the stained letter she had pulled from her dress and now held in a white-knuckled grip. It was tied with a piece of brown string. Her whole life, her whole story, was folded into that small, fragile square. She could not speak of it. She could not tell this stranger who she was or what had been done to her. To speak the truth would be to give him a weapon to use against her. But to refuse his offer was to die. She looked up at him, her gaze traveling from his worn boots to his steady hands to his quiet, unreadable face. He was a stranger, a man, and she was terrified of both. But he had not hurt her when he could have. That had to count for something. She could not find the words to say yes. Instead, she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, a silent agreement. Eli accepted it without question. "All right then," he said, as if she had just agreed to pass him the salt at a dinner table. "We will rest today. Let the horses recover. We will leave in the morning." He did not ask her name, and she did not ask his. In the vast, silent emptiness of the American West, they were just two strangers, bound for a little while by a storm and the unspoken weight of the ghosts they carried. Clara clutched her letter, the paper a frail shield against a world she no longer knew how to face. For now, she would ride with him, and she would watch him, every single second. The world that greeted them after the storm was one of harsh, unforgiving beauty. A sea of white snow stretched to a horizon so sharp it looked as if it could cut a man in two. Riding was slow, the horses sinking to their fetlocks with every step. Eli Carver rode ahead, his broad back a dark, solid shape for Clara to fix her eyes upon. She rode Gideon, his brother's horse, while Eli led his own buckskin. He had insisted, saying the buckskin was sure of foot. The truth, she suspected, was that Gideon was a gentler, calmer animal, less likely to spook. It was another small, unspoken kindness that she did not know how to receive. For 2 days they moved through the snow, the silence broken only by the creak of saddle leather and the soft plodding of the hooves. At night, Eli would build a fire in the shelter of a rocky outcrop, the flames a defiant orange against the vast, star-dusted blackness. He would pass her a share of their food, jerky, hardtack, and hot, bitter coffee brewed in a tin pot, and they would eat without speaking. 2 solitary figures huddled together for warmth in an immense and indifferent wilderness. On the 3rd day, the snow began to recede, giving way to a landscape of frozen mud and then to the dry, cracked earth of the plains. The terrain grew more difficult, a jagged country of wind-scoured buttes and deep, shadowy arroyos. The wind returned, not with the fury of the blizzard, but as a persistent, whining thief that stole the warmth from their bones and kicked up dust that stung their eyes and coated their throats. One afternoon, the sky turned a sickly yellow-brown. Eli stopped, his head raised, sniffing the air like an animal. "Dust storm," he said, his voice flat. "We need cover. Now." He led them into a narrow canyon, its high rock walls offering some protection. They dismounted and pressed themselves against the stone, pulling their neckerchiefs over their faces as the world outside the canyon dissolved into a howling, suffocating cloud of sand and grit. The storm raged for hours, a relentless assault that made it impossible to see or speak. Clara huddled with her back to the rock, her eyes squeezed shut. At one point, a powerful gust threatened to tear her from her feet, before she could be thrown. Eli moved, shifting his body to shield hers, taking the brunt of the wind. He did not touch her, but his presence was a solid wall beside her, a buffer against the storm's fury. When the wind finally died down, leaving a strange, heavy silence, they were both covered in a fine layer of dust, looking like 2 statues carved from the earth itself. He simply nodded, pushed himself upright, and went to check on the horses, as if shielding her had been no more remarkable than breathing. That night, the cold was a living thing. It crept into their bedrolls and settled deep into their joints. As they sat by the fire, Clara shivered, her hands trembling as she held her tin cup of coffee. The flames cast dancing shadows on Eli's face, carving deep lines around his eyes and mouth. He was not a handsome man, not in the way of the slick-haired gamblers and merchants she had known in her past life. His face was too worn, too quiet. It was a face made of angles and patience, weathered by sun and sorrow. "You are cold," he stated, not a question. Before she could answer, he stood, retrieved his own bedroll, and laid it around her shoulders. It was heavy, smelling of wool, dust, and him. The unexpected weight and warmth of it startled her. She looked up at him, her throat tight. "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. He just grunted in response and sat back down, staring into the fire as if it held the answers to some question he had long since forgotten how to ask. The silence stretched, but for the first time, it felt less like a void and more like a shared space. Clara found herself wanting to fill it, to offer something in return for his quiet decency. "I used to be a teacher," she said, the words coming out in a rush, surprising them both. Eli turned his head, his gray eyes fixing on her. He did not press, just waited. "In a small schoolhouse east of here, I taught children their letters, their numbers, how to read from the Bible." A faint, sad smile touched her lips. Their hands were always sticky. He considered this for a moment. My brother, Jacob. He never did learn to read proper. He could sign his name, and that was about all. Never saw the need for it. Said the earth told him everything he needed to know. Eli's gaze drifted back to the fire, and a shadow passed over his features. The earth did not tell him about the kind of men who would shoot a boy over a handful of scrawny cattle. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and heavy. Clara saw then that his silence was not one of emptiness, but of fullness. It was a silence crowded with ghosts. The war took our farm, he went on, his voice a low murmur. I went to fight for the Union. My father died while I was gone. When I came back, the bank had taken the land. There was nothing left but weeds and my mother's grave. He picked up a stick and poked at the embers, sending a shower of sparks into the darkness. Jacob was all I had left. Now I am just taking him home. Clara pulled the bedroll tighter around her. His grief was a plain, solid thing, like a rock you could hold in your hand. It was different from her own, which was a tangled, shameful mess of fear and violation. She had been the daughter of a banker, a man whose name had once commanded respect. Her father had been a good man, a kind man, who had built a small fortune on trust and shrewd investments in the railroad. And then, one day, it was all gone. The accusations, the scandal, the whispers that followed her everywhere, his name ruined, her future erased. She had become nothing, just a piece of property to be used and discarded. She could not tell Eli that part. She could not bear to see the quiet respect in his eyes curdle into pity, or worse, disgust. As she shifted to get more comfortable, the sleeve of her tattered dress rode up her arm. In the firelight, a network of thin white lines on the inside of her wrist stood out against her skin. She saw Eli's gaze flicker down, his eyes resting on the scars for a brief, sharp second. She froze, expecting a question, a comment, some sign of judgment. He said nothing. He simply lifted his gaze back to the fire, his expression unchanged, granting her the dignity of her secrets. In that moment, a fragile, tentative shoot of trust began to grow in the barren soil of her heart. They reached the town of Redemption a few days later. It was a sorry collection of unpainted wooden buildings huddled along a single, wide street of rutted mud, a place where men came to lose their paychecks and their morals. As they rode in, people stopped to stare. They stared at Eli's worn gear and the grim set of his jaw, but mostly, they stared at Clara, at her torn, filthy dress, the ugly bruise on her face, and her wild red hair. The women looked at her with open contempt, the men with a leering, speculative hunger that made her skin crawl. She pulled the bedroll tighter, wishing it could make her invisible. Eli seemed oblivious to the stares. He stopped in front of the livery stable. I will see to the horses, he said. There is a general store down the way. Get what we need. Food, some soap, and a dress, if they have one that will fit you. He pressed a few coins into her hand. Her fingers recoiled from his touch, but she took the money. Walking down the dusty boardwalk alone felt like walking a gauntlet. Every eye was on her. She kept her head down, her gaze fixed on the splintered planks beneath her feet. The general store was a dim, cluttered place that smelled of coffee beans, cured leather, and dust. She gathered what they needed, her movements quick and furtive. A sack of flour, coffee, bacon, and a small bar of lye soap. In a dusty corner, she found a rack of ready-made dresses. She picked out the plainest one she could find, a simple calico of a faded blue color. As she stood at the counter, waiting for the shopkeeper to tally her purchases, two women stood nearby, their heads bent together in whispered conversation. Clara tried not to listen, but a few words snagged her attention, sharp as fishhooks. Wichita, one of them murmured. Clara's blood ran cold. Heard tell Silas Black is offering a handsome reward, the other woman said, her voice dripping with sanctimonious relish. For that red-haired girl from his house of ill repute. Says she stole from him. But my husband says Silas is just mad she ran off. Bad for business. You know, he cannot have his property just walking away. Property with red hair is rare, I suppose. Ought to be easy enough to spot. The shopkeeper cleared his throat, and the women fell silent, casting sidelong glances at Clara's hair, which she had tried to tuck under Eli's old hat, but strands of it had escaped, burning like fire against the pale skin of her neck. Clara's heart began to hammer against her ribs. A bounty. He had put a bounty on her. She was not just a runaway. She was hunted prey. The walls of the store seemed to close in, the air growing thick and suffocating. She paid for her items, her hands shaking so badly she could barely count the coins. She fled the store, leaving the new dress behind on the counter. All she could think of was escape. She could not endanger the man who had helped her. He did not know what she was, what they called her. If they found her with him, they would hurt him, too. She had to run. She did not go back to the livery. Instead, she turned down an alleyway, her breath coming in ragged, panicked sobs. She ran, stumbling through the mud and filth behind the buildings, her only thought to get away, to disappear back into the wilderness where she belonged. She found herself behind the town's dilapidated barn, the air thick with the smell of manure and rotting hay. She collapsed behind a water trough, curling into a tight ball, trying to make herself small, invisible. The whispers followed her. Stolen. Whore. Property. The words echoed the ones that had been branded on her soul for months. She was nothing but a thing to be bought and sold, used and broken. A wave of nausea washed over her. She was trapped. There was nowhere to run where his name and his money could not reach. She heard footsteps, slow and steady, squelching in the mud. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with terror. It was him, Eli. He had come around the side of the barn, his expression unreadable. He must have heard. He must know what she was. He would turn her in for the reward, or worse, he would take the reward for himself. Right here in the mud, he would use her just like all the others. He took a step toward her. She scrambled backward, her back hitting the rough, damp wood of the barn. "No," she gasped, the word barely a whisper. "Please." He stopped, holding his hands up slightly, the same way he had in the cabin. But this time, it did not soothe her. The terror was too deep. A wild animal thrashing inside her chest. He took another slow step. Panic, pure and absolute, seized her. Tears streamed down her face, hot and shameful. The words tore from her throat, a raw, desperate plea that was half prayer, half sob. "Promise me you will not hurt me." The sound of her own voice, so broken and pathetic, shattered the last of her control. She buried her face in her hands, her body shaking with violent, uncontrollable tremors. She waited for the rough hands, the blow, the inevitable pain. But it did not come. After a long moment, she dared to peek through her fingers. Eli Carver had not taken another step. Instead, he had sunk to one knee in the filthy mud. He had removed his hat, holding it in both hands at his chest in a gesture of profound respect. He was kneeling before her, his head slightly bowed. He was not looking at her with hunger or contempt, but with an expression of such deep, quiet sorrow it stole her breath. He was not a threat. He was an absolution. He did not speak. He did not need to. In that single, humble gesture, he had given her his promise. He had seen her at her most broken, heard her at her most terrified, and he had not judged her. He had knelt. The fight went out of her, replaced by an exhaustion so profound she felt her bones might dissolve. He remained there, kneeling in the mud, a silent sentinel, until her sobs quieted into ragged, hiccuping breaths. Only then did he slowly rise, his movements careful, as if she were a wild fawn he was afraid of frightening away. "Let's go," he said, his voice soft. "This is no place to be." He helped her to her feet, his touch on her elbow light and respectful. He led her back to the livery, where the horses were saddled and ready. He had her purchases, including the blue calico dress, tied onto his saddle. He had known she would run. They rode out of redemption without a backward glance, the whispers and the leers fading behind them. They rode until the sun began to set, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and that town. That night, when they made camp, the air was different. The wall of fear and distrust between them had been irrevocably breached. After they ate, Eli laid out their bedrolls side by side. He sat and watched the fire, giving her space. Clara lay down, but sleep would not come. The events of the day played over and over in her mind. The whispers, the panic, and the image of Eli, kneeling in the mud. She was trembling again, not from fear this time, but from the aftershocks of it. A deep, cellular cold that the fire could not touch. Eli must have sensed it. He turned his head. "You are safe, Clara," he said, using her name for the first time. The sound of it on his lips was strangely comforting. "I know," she whispered, but the trembling would not stop. He hesitated for a moment, then moved over to her. He lay down on his bedroll beside her, on top of the covers, and gently, cautiously, pulled her against his side. He wrapped an arm around her, holding her with a firm, steady pressure that was entirely protective. He rested his chin on the top of her head. He was warm and solid, a bulwark against the vast, dark emptiness of the night. His breathing was slow and even, a steady rhythm against her back. Clara went rigid at first, her muscles screaming in protest at the contact. But he did not move, did not press, did not demand anything from her. He just held her, slowly, painstakingly. The tension began to drain out of her. The rigid line of her back softened. The trembling subsided. She allowed herself to sink into his warmth, into the feeling of being held without threat. For the first time in months, she felt safe, utterly, completely safe, tucked against the side of this quiet, grieving cowboy, under a blanket of 1,000,000,000 stars. Clara Dalton closed her eyes and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. The night after they fled redemption, a new quiet settled between them, different from the heavy silence of before. It was a space of knowing. He knew she was a fugitive, and she knew that he did not care. As they sat by the fire, the flames reflecting in his steady gray eyes, Clara felt the story she had held captive in her heart begin to push against her lips, demanding release. The safety he had offered her was a key, turning the lock on a door she thought would remain bolted forever. She began to speak, her voice low and brittle, a sound that seemed as if it might shatter in the cold night air. She told him of her father, James Dalton, a man whose laughter had once filled their large Philadelphia home, whose integrity had been the bedrock of their lives. He was the chief financial officer for a new railroad line, a position of immense trust. He had a partner, a man he called his friend, named Alistair Finch, a man Clara had called uncle. "My father trusted him with everything," she said, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "Our money, our future, his good name, and Alistair, he was a hollow man. He built a labyrinth of false ledgers and forged signatures, siphoning money for months. When the railroad inspectors began to ask questions, he vanished, and the entire scheme collapsed on my father's head." The words came faster now, a torrent of memory and pain. She spoke of the shame, the way their friends had turned their backs, the whispers that followed them on the street. Her father, a proud man, could not endure it. The authorities had issued a warrant for his arrest. He was to be tried for embezzlement and fraud. "They came for him at dawn," Clara whispered, her hands clenched into fists in her lap. "But they were too late. He was in his study. He had used his own belt." She choked on the words, the image of it searing her mind. He had hanged himself from the great oak beam that ran across the ceiling, leaving behind nothing but a note proclaiming his innocence and a daughter who was now utterly alone in a world that believed her to be the child of a thief and a coward. Eli said nothing. He just listened, his stillness a vessel for her grief. Alistair came back after the funeral, she continued, her voice hardening. He feigned sympathy. He said he would take care of me, that my father had left me in his charge. He was my legal guardian. I was a fool. I was grieving, and I believed him. She let out a dry, bitter laugh that sounded like stones scraping together. He told me we had to go west, to start over where no one knew our name. He brought me to Wichita, but he did not take me to a new home. He took me to a house owned by a man named Silas Black. He told them I was an orphan with loose morals, a runaway he had caught stealing. He had papers, false charges he had drawn up himself. He sold me. He sold me to that man for the price of my father's gold watch and $200. She finally looked at him, her eyes burning with unshed tears. The law will not help me. Eli, to them, I am the daughter of a criminal, and he is a concerned citizen who placed a wayward girl into a corrective establishment. My word against his, whose do you think they would believe? A deep, chilling quiet descended upon their small camp. The fire crackled and spat, oblivious to the human wreckage before it. Eli's face was carved from stone, his expression unreadable. But Clara could see a muscle twitching in his jaw, a slow, rhythmic clenching. He picked up the stick he had been using to tend the fire and snapped it in two with his bare hands, the sharp crack echoing in the stillness. He is a dead man, Eli said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that was more terrifying than any shout. It was a statement of fact, not a threat, a promise. No, Clara said immediately, a new fear rising in her. You cannot, that is what he wants. He wants me silenced, buried. If you go after him, they will hunt you down. I will not be the cause of your death, too. Justice has to be done. There is no justice for women like me, she shot back, the bitterness sharp on her tongue. There is only survival. He looked at her then, and the cold fury in his eyes was so intense it made her breath catch. It was the righteous anger of a good man confronted with a profound evil. He wanted to fight for her, to right the wrongs that had been done to her. And in that moment, she understood that her survival depended not just on running, but on keeping this man from throwing his own life away on a battle he could not win. 2 days later, they arrived at the Lyle Ranch. It was nestled in a shallow valley, protected from the wind by a stand of aging cottonwood trees. The ranch house was a sturdy, 2-story structure made of timber and stone, with a wide porch and smoke curling lazily from the chimney. It was an island of order and persistence in the vast, untamed land. A woman came out onto the porch as they approached. She was tall and lean, her hair pulled back in a severe bun that showed streaks of gray. She held a rifle loosely in the crook of her arm. Her eyes narrowed with suspicion. Eli Carver, she said, her voice raspy but strong. I thought the ward swallowed you whole. Not yet, Martha, Eli replied, swinging down from his horse. This is Clara. We need a place to stay for a while. We can work for our keep. Martha Lyle's sharp eyes raked over Clara, taking in the new but ill-fitting dress, the lingering bruise on her cheek, and the haunted look in her eyes. Clara braced herself for the judgment. The questions. But the older woman simply nodded. The north bedroom is empty. Supper is at 6. The pump is out back if you want to wash the trail off you. She turned and went back inside, the screen door slamming shut behind her. The north bedroom was small and spare, containing only a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a washstand with a basin and pitcher, and a single window that looked out over the rolling, sun-bleached hills. It was the most beautiful room Clara had ever seen. It had a door that latched from the inside. It was safe. That night, for the first time since leaving Philadelphia, she slept in a real bed, under a real roof, and did not dream of fire or falling. The days that followed fell into a gentle, healing rhythm. Martha was a woman of few words but tireless energy. She ran the ranch mostly by herself, with the help of a single aging ranch hand named Jed. Clara began to help in the kitchen, tentatively at first, but soon with a growing sense of purpose. She kneaded dough for bread, her hands rediscovering a familiar, comforting motion. She peeled potatoes, her mind focused on the simple, repetitive task. She helped Martha mend clothes and churn butter. The kitchen was warm and filled with the smells of baking bread, simmering stew, and brewing coffee. In this place of simple, honest work, Clara began to find pieces of herself she thought were lost forever. She was not Silas Black's property. She was not a ruined woman. She was a person who could create nourishment and comfort. One afternoon, while rolling out a pie crust, she found herself humming a tune from her childhood. She stopped abruptly, surprised by the sound. Martha, who was sitting at the table shelling peas, looked up and gave her a rare, small smile. Eli, meanwhile, had thrown himself into the work of the ranch. He mended fences, repaired the barn roof, and helped Jed with the cattle. He worked from sunup to sundown, as if trying to physically exhaust the ghosts that rode with him. Clara would watch him from the kitchen window. She watched the easy, powerful way he moved, the silent strength in his shoulders as he lifted heavy timbers. She watched his hands, which were calloused and worn, yet so capable, whether he was fixing a broken harness or gently calming a nervous horse. One morning, Jed brought in a wild Mustang, a magnificent creature of muscle and fire, its eyes rolling with terror. "This one's got the devil in him," Jed grumbled, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "More trouble than he is worth." Eli walked into the corral, closing the gate behind him. He did not have a whip or a rope. He just stood there, his body relaxed, speaking to the horse in a low, calm murmur. The Mustang snorted, pawing at the ground, every line of its body screaming fight or flight. Clara came out onto the porch to watch, her heart in her throat. For hours, Eli worked with the horse. He did not try to break its spirit. He seemed to be trying to reason with it. He moved slowly, patiently, mirroring the horse's movements, retreating when it showed fear, advancing when it calmed. He eventually got a halter on it, not by force, but by waiting until the horse allowed him to. By late afternoon, the Mustang, its coat dark with sweat, was standing still, allowing Eli to stroke its neck. It was a surrender born not of defeat, but of trust. Clara watched, mesmerized. She saw in his patient, gentle handling of that terrified animal a reflection of how he had treated her. He had not tried to force her story from her. He had not tried to break her will. He had simply been present, quiet and strong, and had waited for her to trust him. A deep, unfamiliar ache bloomed in her chest, a feeling so potent it was almost painful. It was a longing for his hands, for his quiet strength, for the safety of his soft gray eyes. She wanted him, not in the way men had wanted her before, as a body to be used, but in a way that felt as if her very soul was reaching for his. That night, a storm rolled in, the thunder rattling the windows of the ranch house. Sometime after midnight, Clara was woken by a sound from the room next to hers, Eli's room. It was a muffled cry, followed by a string of guttural, panicked words she could not understand. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding. The cry came again, sharper this time, filled with a raw agony. Without thinking, she slipped out of bed and crept to his door, pushing it open a crack. In the dim light from the hallway lamp, she could see him on the bed, thrashing in his sleep, caught in the grips of a nightmare. His hands were clenched, his face contorted in a mask of torment. "Cannon fire! They are coming through the trees! Get down!" he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep and terror. She saw the boy he had been, the young soldier lost in the smoke and chaos of a forgotten battlefield. The protector was gone, and in his place was a man drowning in his own memories. Her fear for him overshadowed her fear of him. She went to his side and gently touched his shoulder. "Eli," she whispered. "Eli, wake up! You are dreaming!" He thrashed away from her touch, letting out a cry of pure anguish. She did not retreat. She sat on the edge of the bed and placed her hand on his forehead, which was slick with sweat. "You are safe," she said, her voice soft but firm, the same words he had once spoken to her. "It is just a dream. You are here, at the ranch. The war is over." She kept talking, her voice a low, soothing murmur, telling him about the sound of the rain on the roof, the smell of the clean sheets, the safety of the four walls around them. Slowly, the thrashing subsided. His breathing grew less ragged. He opened his eyes, staring up at her, but his gaze was unfocused, still seeing the horrors of his dream. He was trembling, a fine, violent tremor that shook his entire body. The roles were reversed. He was the one who was broken, and she was the one who was whole. A fierce, protective instinct rose in her. She slid her arm under his neck and cradled his head against her chest, holding him the way one might hold a frightened child. She felt his body go rigid for a moment, and then, with a shuddering sigh, he relaxed into her embrace, his face pressed against her nightgown. He allowed her to comfort him. He allowed himself to be vulnerable. They stayed like that for a long time, her fingers stroking his hair, his trembling slowly ceasing under her touch. The only sound was the drumming of the rain and the steady beat of her own heart. He was awake now, fully present, but he made no move to pull away. Finally, he lifted his head. His face was just inches from hers. The shadows in the room were deep, but she could see the sheen of tears in his eyes. He looked at her with a raw, unguarded need that mirrored the ache in her own chest. He had seen the ugliest parts of her, and now she had seen his. There were no more secrets between them, only a shared landscape of pain. He leaned in, slowly, giving her every chance to turn away. She did not. She met him halfway. The kiss was not gentle. It was hesitant, painful, and desperate. It was the kiss of two people who had forgotten what tenderness felt like. His lips were rough against hers, and she could taste the salt of his tears. It was a kiss of shared sorrow, of a desperate, unspoken need to find an anchor in the storm of memory. It was too much, and not nearly enough. It was everything. A fire ignited deep within her, a feeling she had thought was dead and buried. It was a warmth, a desire, a profound wanting that had nothing to do with shame or submission. It was hers. But with that fire came a terrible, chilling fear. This feeling, this man, could be a new beginning, and she did not deserve a new beginning. Everything she touched, she destroyed. Her father, her own life. She was a curse. To let Eli get close, to let him love her, would be to condemn him. The same darkness that had swallowed her father would swallow him, too. She could not bear that. She broke the kiss, pushing against his chest with a strength that surprised them both. She scrambled off the bed, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "I cannot," she whispered, shaking her head, backing away toward the door. Eli looked at her, his face a mask of confusion and hurt. "Clara!" "I am sorry," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "I cannot." She turned and fled back to her room, latching the door behind her. She leaned against the cool wood, her body trembling, her lips still burning from his kiss. She had wanted him, and for one brief, terrifying moment, she had allowed herself to have him. But the ghosts of her past were stronger than any desire. They stood in the dark corners of the room, whispering that she was tainted, that she was poison, and that she would ruin this good, quiet man if she let him get too close. And so she had pushed him away, back into the loneliness where she believed he would be safe from her. The fragile peace they had found at the Lyle Ranch was shattered by a single name, carried in on the wind with the dust from town. Jed, the old ranch hand, returned from a supply run with a sack of flour and a pocket full of gossip. As he sat at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee, he spoke of a new man in the territory. "A bounty hunter," he said, his voice low. "A cold fish, they say. Name of Cordell. Asks a lot of questions about a red-haired woman. Seems some rich fella in Wichita is paying a king's ransom for her return." Clara, who had been wiping down the counter, froze. The rag fell from her nerveless fingers. The name struck her like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. Cordell. It was a name she had prayed she would never hear again. He was not just a bounty hunter. He had been Silas Black's right hand, the enforcer who managed the women. He was a man without a soul, his eyes as empty and gray as a winter sky. He was the one who had watched her, whose presence had been a constant, silent threat. He was the man she had feared more than Black himself. Eli, who was mending a bridle by the hearth, saw the blood drain from her face. He saw the sheer, animal terror that seized her, a terror that went beyond the fear of being caught. This was personal. He set the leather aside and stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. "Clara?" he said softly. She could not speak, could not breathe. She just shook her head, her eyes wide and staring. The kitchen, which had become her sanctuary, was suddenly a cage. Later that evening, when the house was quiet, Eli found her on the porch, staring out into the darkness. The silence between them was taut with unspoken questions. "Tell me about him," Eli said, his voice a low command. "He worked for Silas," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He was my keeper. He enjoyed the power of it. He liked to watch us, to remind us that we were not human beings, just investments." She wrapped her arms around herself, a futile attempt to ward off the phantom chill of Cordell's gaze. "He will not stop. He is like a hound from hell. He will not stop until he finds me." A cold, hard certainty settled in Eli's gut. He thought back to the town of redemption, to the whispers Clara had overheard. Someone had known she was there, and now a bounty hunter was in the territory. It was too much to be a coincidence. He looked toward the main house, where a single lamp burned in Martha Lyle's window. He found her in her parlor, reading her Bible by the light of the lamp. She looked up as he entered, her expression wary. "Martha," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "When Jed was in town, did you send a wire for him?" Martha's hand tightened on her book. She did not meet his eyes. "The fence in the west pasture needs mending. I had him wire for more posts." "And what else?" Eli pressed, taking a step closer. "Did you tell him to send another message? To a man in Wichita, perhaps?" The color drained from her face. Her hard, weathered features seemed to crumple. "The ranch is failing. Eli," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Since my Henry died, I cannot keep up. The bank is threatening to foreclose. The reward, it was enough to save this place, my home." The betrayal was a bitter pill. This place, which had felt like a haven, was just another trap. Eli felt a cold fury rise in him, but it was tempered by the pathetic sight of the woman before him. She was not a monster. She was just a desperate woman, like so many others, who had been broken by the harshness of the land and her own loneliness. He will not just take her. "Martha," Eli said, his voice laced with ice, "a man like Cordell will hurt her, and when he is done, he will likely kill you to keep you quiet. You have not saved your home. You have sold both our lives for it." Regret, stark and terrible, dawned in her eyes. I did not think." "No," Eli cut her off. "You did not." He turned and left her there, alone with her Bible and her sin. There was only one choice. They had to run, not just to another territory, but further, west, past the reach of telegraphs and railroads, to a place where the law of men like Silas Black and Cordell could not follow. To California, maybe, or the Oregon territories. A place where a man and a woman could start over, with no names but the ones they gave themselves. The next morning, he rode into town. He did not take Gideon, the horse that had belonged to his brother. He rode his own buckskin, the animal that had carried him for 5 years, that had been his only steady companion through war and loss. Clara watched him go, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. He returned in the late afternoon, not on horseback, but driving a small, sturdy wagon pulled by 2 mules. The back of the wagon was loaded with supplies, sacks of flour and beans, barrels of water, ammunition, and a new rifle. Clara came out to meet him, her eyes searching for his horse. "Where is the buckskin?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "He is worth more than the mules and the wagon combined," Eli said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He would not look at her. The sale of his horse was an amputation. A part of him had been cut away, and the wound was still fresh. He had traded his freedom, his ability to ride away, for this slow, lumbering wagon. For her. The weight of his sacrifice settled on her, heavy and profound. He had given up the last piece of his old life for the uncertain promise of a new one with her. They would leave before dawn. That night, the air in the ranch house was thick with unspoken goodbyes and the tension of the coming journey. Clara could not bear to be in her small, safe room, knowing it had been a lie. She went to the barn, seeking solace in the quiet company of the animals and the sweet smell of hay. She climbed the ladder to the loft, where she could look out a small window at the moonlit hills. She heard him come up the ladder behind her. He did not light a lantern. He came and stood beside her in the darkness, 2 shadows among the greater shadows of the barn. "I am sorry, Eli," she whispered, her voice thick. "I have brought you nothing but trouble. You should have left me in that cabin." "No," he said, his voice a low rumble beside her. "Before you, I was not traveling to anything. I was just moving away. It is not the same thing." He turned to her then, and in the slivers of moonlight filtering through the cracks in the walls, she could see the raw emotion in his eyes. The weariness, the grief, but something else too. Something tender and fierce that was just for her. He reached out and touched her face, his calloused thumb stroking her cheek with a reverence that made her tremble. The kiss from the other night had been a desperate, painful thing. This was different. This was a choice. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut. When he lowered his head to kiss her, she met him with a yearning that had been locked away for a lifetime. This time, there was no pulling away. He led her to a soft pile of hay in the corner of the loft, and they came together with a slow, tender desperation. It was not a battle for control or a frantic slaking of lust. It was a quiet, deliberate act of healing. It was 2 broken souls trying to stitch themselves back together with gentle hands and whispered words. For Eli, it was the end of a long vow of loneliness he had made after the war. For Clara, it was a revelation. It was the first time a man's touch had not been about ownership, but about worship. It was the first time she had been wanted, not just for her body, but for the scarred and battered entirety of who she was. Afterward, as she lay in his arms, the scent of hay and his skin filling her senses, a deep, shuddering sob escaped her, then another and another, until she was weeping, a storm of tears she could not control. It was not a cry of sadness, but of release. It was the sound of a dam breaking, of years of pain, shame, and loneliness washing away, leaving behind a raw, clean sense of wonder. To be touched with love, to be wanted, was a feeling so overwhelming, so foreign that it broke her open. Eli just held her, stroking her hair, letting her cry until the storm passed, leaving a quiet peace in its wake. They left 2 hours before dawn, a pair of ghosts slipping away into the pre-dawn gray. Martha Lyle stood on the porch, a silhouette in the lamplight, and watched them go. She did not speak, and they did not look back. 2 hours after the sun had risen, another rider approached the ranch. He was a tall man on a sleek black horse, and he moved with an unnerving economy of motion. He dismounted and strode onto the porch where Martha still stood, her face ashen. "I am looking for a woman," Cordell said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Red hair. Answers to the name of Rose, but her real name is Clara." "There is no one here by that name," Martha said, her voice shaking. Cordell's eyes, the color of chips of ice, narrowed. He smiled, a thin, cruel slash in his face. "Do not lie to me, old woman. I can smell a lie like a snake smells a rat. I know she was here. Your wire said as much." He took a step closer, invading her space. "Now, you can tell me which way they went, and I will let you live out your miserable days on this pathetic patch of dirt. Or you can be stubborn, and I will burn it to the ground with you inside." Trembling, Martha pointed a shaky finger to the west. "They left before dawn, in a wagon." Cordell's smile widened. "A wagon? Good. They will be slow." He turned and swung back onto his horse, a predator catching the scent of his prey. The journey west was a descent into a new kind of hell. The rolling hills gave way to a barren, sun-blasted desert. The heat was relentless, a physical weight that pressed down on them, draining their strength and their hope. The mules plodded along, their heads low, the wagon wheels grinding in the sand. Days blurred into a monotonous cycle of heat, dust, and thirst. They spoke little, conserving their energy. The water in their barrels grew warm and tasted of metal. Clara, unaccustomed to such hardship, began to weaken. The color left her cheeks, and her eyes were shadowed with exhaustion. Eli watched her with a growing sense of desperation, rationing their water, trying to shield her from the worst of the sun with a canvas tarp. On the 5th day, they saw the dust cloud behind them. It was distant, but unmistakable. A single rider, moving much faster than they were. Cordell. "We have to leave the wagon," Eli said, his voice grim. "He will catch us in a day if we stay with it. We will take what water we can carry and head for those rocks." He pointed to a jagged spine of red rock mountains on the horizon. "We can lose him in the canyons." They abandoned the wagon, the symbol of their new life, in the middle of the vast, empty desert. Eli half-carried Clara, who was now stumbling with fatigue and dehydration. The rocks were further than they looked. It took them the rest of the day to reach the foothills, their water almost gone. The canyons were a maze of towering red walls and deep shadows. It was cooler here, out of the direct sun, but the terrain was treacherous. They scrambled over boulders and through narrow passages, Eli's arm a steady support around Clara's waist. He found a shallow cave, hidden behind a curtain of ancient, twisted juniper trees, a place where they could hide and rest. As dusk fell, painting the canyon walls in shades of orange and purple, they huddled together in the cave. They had a few mouthfuls of water left. Clara was shivering, her body succumbing to the strain. "He is still coming, is he not?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. Eli looked out through the branches of the juniper. He could see the vast, empty plain stretching out below them. "Yes," he said. He did not have to wait long. As the last of the light faded from the sky, a lone figure on a black horse appeared at the mouth of the canyon. Cordell sat on his horse, motionless, studying the maze of rocks as if he had all the time in the world. He was patient. He knew they were trapped. He knew they were out of water. All he had to do was wait. Eli pulled Clara deeper into the shadows of the cave, his hand resting on the stock of his rifle. The hunt was over. The fight was about to begin. The dawn came not with light, but with a voice. It was a calm, conversational tone that echoed unnervingly in the quiet canyon, a serpent's whisper in the garden of their fear. "Rose," Cordell's voice called out, smooth as polished stone. "I know you are in here. Silas sends his regards. He's very eager to have his favorite piece of property returned. Clara, huddled in the back of the small cave, flinched as if struck. The name he used, the casual mention of Silas, the word property. Each was a calculated cruelty designed to strip away the fragile identity she had begun to build and remind her of the thing she used to be. Eli put a warning hand on her arm, his eyes fixed on the cave's entrance. "There is no sense in hiding, little bird," the voice continued, closer now. "You cannot fly on a broken wing, and your protector there, well, he is just a man, and men can be broken." The sound of a boot scraping on rock sent a fresh wave of terror through Clara. He was toying with them, enjoying their fear, drawing it out like a fine cigar. "I have water, Rose, and food. Your cowboy looks like he is about done in. You must be terribly thirsty." The temptation was a vile thing, a hook disguised as kindness. Her throat was a desert, her tongue a piece of dry leather in her mouth. Eli knew the waiting was the worst part of the torture. He checked his rifle, the click of the mechanism unnervingly loud in the silence. He had 6 shots. Cordell was a patient hunter, but he would not wait forever. The sun was rising, and the heat would soon become their enemy as much as the man outside. The attack, when it came, was swift and silent. There was no shout, no warning. One moment the entrance was empty. The next, Cordell was there, a dark shape moving with a predator's grace. He was not a big man, but he was wiry and fast, his movements economical and deadly. Before Eli could bring his rifle to bear, Cordell had crossed the small space and seized Clara, yanking her from the shadows and spinning her around to use as a shield. The cold, steel barrel of a revolver pressed hard against her temple. "Drop the rifle, cowboy," Cordell said, his voice losing its mocking tone, replaced now by a flat, business-like command. His breath was hot on Clara's cheek, smelling of stale coffee and malice. "Or I will put a hole in this pretty head and just drag the body back. Silas pays either way." Clara stood frozen, a statue of terror. She could feel the man's heart beating against her back, a slow, steady rhythm that was utterly devoid of passion or fear. This was just a job to him. She was just cargo. Eli's face was a grim mask. He looked at the gun pressed to Clara's head, at the cold, dead eyes of the man holding her. He slowly, deliberately, lowered the rifle and let it fall to the sandy floor of the cave. Cordell smiled, a thin, reptilian expression. "Good boy." His attention shifted to Clara, his free hand stroking her hair in a gesture of ownership that made her skin crawl. "Look at you, all scratched up and covered in dirt. Silas likes his things kept clean. Rose, we are going to have to fix that when we get back." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper meant for both of them to hear. "He has missed you. He has all sorts of new games he wants to play. He told me to tell you that." Each word was a drop of poison. He was not just threatening her with pain, but with humiliation, with the complete annihilation of her soul. He was reminding her that she was nothing, a plaything for a cruel master. Clara's eyes met Eli's over Cordell's shoulder. She saw a pain in his expression that had nothing to do with thirst or exhaustion. It was the pain of a man forced to watch the person he cared for be tormented, and he was helpless to stop it. That look broke through Eli's control. He would not let this man degrade her, not 1 second more. He took a slow step forward, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "Let her go," Eli said, his voice a low growl. "Your business is with her, not me, but you want blood, do you not? A story to tell back in Wichita about how you tamed the runaway and her protector." He took another step. "So take mine. She has already given enough." Cordell's eyes flickered toward Eli, a flicker of interest in his cold gaze. He saw the challenge, the raw defiance in the cowboy's stance. This was more interesting than simply collecting his bounty. "You think your life is worth hers?" Cordell sneered. "I do," Eli said, his voice unwavering. "So let her go. Let her walk out of this canyon. You have my word I will not follow. Then you and I can settle this. For a long moment, Cordell considered it. Then he laughed, a dry, humorless sound. I admire the sentiment, Cowboy, truly, but I am not a sentimental man. He shoved Clara away from him. She stumbled and fell to the ground. As Eli's gaze instinctively followed her, Cordell raised his revolver. The gunshot was a deafening crack in the enclosed space. Pain, white-hot and blinding, exploded in Eli's left shoulder. The force of the bullet spun him around, and his legs buckled beneath him. He collapsed to the ground, a strangled cry escaping his lips as he clutched at the wound. Blood, shockingly hot and wet, poured through his fingers. Everything seemed to happen in slow motion for Clara. The shove, the blast, the sight of Eli falling. Something inside her, a cord that had been stretched taut for months, for years, finally snapped. The terror, the shame, the helplessness. It all burned away in a sudden, volcanic eruption of pure, cleansing rage. This man had hurt him. This man, who had shown her nothing but kindness, who had knelt for her in the mud, who had held her while she wept. This creature had put a bullet in him. She did not scream. She did not cry. She moved. Near the back of the cave, where a long dead fire pit marked an old campsite, a piece of rusted metal lay half buried in the sand. It was a long, heavy iron rod, once used as a fire poker or perhaps a branding iron left behind by some forgotten cattle drive. Her hand closed around the cool, rough metal. It felt solid, real, a weapon. Cordell, his attention on the wounded man on the ground, had turned his back on her. He was walking toward Eli, savoring his victory, preparing to deliver the final shot. With a guttural cry that was more animal than human, Clara launched herself across the cave. She swung the iron rod with all the force of her desperation and rage. The metal connected with the back of Cordell's head with a sickening thud. Cordell grunted in pain and surprise, stumbling forward. He had underestimated her. He had seen a broken toy, not a cornered she-cat with claws. He turned, his face a mask of disbelief that quickly contorted into fury. A thin line of blood trickled from his scalp into his eye. He lunged for her, but Clara was wild, fueled by an adrenaline she had never known. She swung the rod again, catching him in the ribs. He roared in pain and grabbed the iron, trying to wrench it from her hands. The fight spilled out of the cave, into the harsh light of the morning sun. It was a brutal, clumsy dance of survival. Cordell was stronger, a trained fighter, but Clara was possessed by a righteous fury that gave her inhuman strength. She kicked, she bit, she clawed, refusing to let go of the iron rod. They struggled on the narrow ledge outside the cave, their feet slipping on the loose gravel. Below them, the canyon floor was 100-foot drop onto jagged, unforgiving rock. Eli, propped on one elbow, his vision blurring, watched in horror. He tried to get to his rifle, but a wave of dizziness and pain washed over him, and he collapsed back into the sand. Cordell finally ripped the iron rod from Clara's grasp and threw it aside. He backhanded her across the face, the force of the blow sending her sprawling onto the very edge of the cliff. He stood over her, his chest heaving, a triumphant, cruel sneer on his face. "You stupid little animal," he panted, raising his revolver to point it at her head. "I should have put you down a long time ago." But as he looked down at her, he did not see the terrified girl from the brothel. He saw a woman with eyes of fire, her face streaked with dirt and blood, glaring up at him with pure, undiluted hatred. In that moment of distraction, as he savored his power, he failed to notice that his own feet were planted precariously on a patch of loose shale at the cliff's edge. Clara saw it. With the last of her strength, she surged upward, not to attack him, but to slam her body into his legs. It was not a powerful blow, but it was enough. Cordell's eyes widened in a comical O of surprise. He flailed his arms, trying to regain his balance. The shale under his boots gave way. For a single, suspended moment, he seemed to hang in the air. Then, with a choked cry of disbelief, he fell backward into the empty space. His scream echoed up the canyon walls, abruptly cut off by a final, sickening crunch from below. And then, silence. The silence was absolute, broken only by the whisper of the wind. Clara lay on the edge of the cliff, her body trembling violently, her cheek pressed against the warm, gritty rock. She was alive. He was gone. She pushed herself up, crawling on her hands and knees back to the cave, back to Eli. He was lying in a pool of his own blood, his face pale as death, his breathing shallow. "Eli!" she choked out, her voice raw. She collapsed in the sand beside him, her strength completely gone. The rage that had sustained her vanished, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion and a trembling that shook her to her very soul. She looked down at her hands, at the dirt and blood under her fingernails. She had fought. She had killed. The thought was terrifying, but strangely distant. All that mattered was the man bleeding in the sand beside her. She tore a strip from the hem of her dress and pressed it against his wound, a futile gesture against such a torrent of blood. "It is my fault," she whispered, the tears finally coming, hot and fast. "Everything. It is all my fault. I am poisoned. Eli, what they did to me, what he did, it is a sickness inside me. No good man could ever truly love me. Not the whole of me. They would only be loving the part that is not spoiled." Her confession, the deepest, darkest fear of her heart, came out in a broken, desperate rush. She was tainted, ruined beyond repair. To love her was to love a disease. Eli's eyes fluttered open. He looked at her, his gaze clouded with pain but still lucid. He saw her tear-streaked face, her trembling hands, her profound self-loathing. He tried to speak, but his throat was too dry. He coughed, a wet, rattling sound. He tried again, forcing the words out, his voice a hoarse, half-conscious croak. "Then let me be the man who tries." The words were a promise, a vow made on the precipice of death. They were the most beautiful things she had ever heard. She lowered her head to his chest and wept, her tears of grief and gratitude falling on his blood-soaked shirt. Time lost its meaning. They drifted in and out of consciousness, the sun beating down on their small cave. Thirst became a torment, and Eli's fever began to rise. Clara did what she could, trying to shield him from the sun, whispering to him when he mumbled in his delirium. She was sure they would die there, in that lonely canyon, their bodies found by vultures. But fate had not abandoned them entirely. Late the next day, a sound drifted up from the plains below, the rumble of wheels, the lowing of oxen, the distant call of a human voice, a wagon train. Clara stumbled out of the cave, waving her arms, her voice a raw, croaking shout. "Help! Please, help us!" They found them minutes later, a small group of grim-faced men with rifles and kind-faced women with worried eyes. They were Mennonites, pioneers heading west, a people of profound faith and quiet determination. They saw the blood, the dead man at the bottom of the cliff, and the two souls hovering on the edge of death, and they did not ask questions. They offered salvation. They carried Eli down the treacherous slope on a makeshift stretcher. They gave Clara water, which she drank like a dying animal. They loaded them into the back of a supply wagon and took them to their camp, which they called a church outpost, a few miles away. It was a temporary settlement built around a small, wooden chapel and a spring of fresh water. A preacher, a man named Reverend Miller with gentle hands and eyes that had seen his share of suffering, took charge of Eli's care. He cleaned the wound, digging out the bullet with a pair of pliers and a bottle of whiskey for anesthetic. He stitched the wound closed and bound it tightly. For the next few days, Clara did not leave Eli's side. They had given him a cot in a clean, quiet tent. The fear that had made her push him away, The fear of her own poisonous past had been burned away in the canyon. She had faced the monster from her past and had won. She was no longer a victim cowering in the shadows. She was a survivor. She sat by his bed, wiping his brow with a cool, damp cloth when the fever took him. She spooned water and thin broth between his lips when he was conscious. She held his hand, her touch no longer tentative or afraid, but firm and steady. She had found something in that canyon worth fighting for, worth living for. As she watched his chest rise and fall with each ragged breath, she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she was no longer afraid of her feelings. She loved this quiet, broken cowboy, and she would not run from it, or him, ever again. The days that followed were quiet, measured in the slow rhythm of healing. At the church outpost, under the patient care of Reverend Miller and the watchful eyes of the Mennonite women, Eli Carver slowly began to mend. The fever broke after 3 days, leaving him weak and pale, but alive. He slept for long stretches, his body engaged in the arduous work of knitting itself back together. During those long, quiet hours, Clara sat by his cot, a silent, unwavering guardian. She changed his bandages, bathed his fevered skin, and held his hand, her touch a constant, reassuring presence. In the stillness of the tent, with the sound of the wind whispering through the prairie grass outside, she found a space to heal as well. The frantic terror that had been her constant companion for so long had been replaced by a deep, steady calm. The ghosts of her past had not vanished, but they had retreated to the shadows, their power diminished. She watched Eli sleep. The harsh lines of his face softened, the ever-present tension in his jaw relaxed. She saw the scars on his hands, the weary set of his shoulders, and the deep, abiding goodness that lay beneath the surface of the hard man he presented to the world. He had offered his life for hers, not with a grand gesture of heroism, but with the simple, quiet conviction of a man who believed she was worth saving. And in doing so, he had saved her in more ways than he could ever know. As his body healed, her spirit found its voice. One evening, as Eli slept peacefully, she asked Reverend Miller for a pen, ink, and paper by the flickering light of a kerosene lamp. She began to write. The words did not come easily at first, but once she began, they flowed in a steady, unstoppable stream. She wrote not as a victim, but as a witness. She wrote of her father, James Dalton, of his honor and his integrity. She detailed, with cold, clear precision, the calculated betrayal of Alistair Finch. She named him. She named the railroad line. She named Silas Black and his house of horrors in Wichita. She described the false charges, her abduction, and her time in that place, choosing her words carefully to convey the truth without dwelling on the sordid details. She told the story of Eli, an honorable stranger who had saved her, and of the bounty hunter, Cordell, who now lay dead at the bottom of a canyon. She wrote all night, the scratching of her pen the only sound in the sleeping camp. When she was finished, the pile of pages on the small table represented the whole of her story, the truth she had carried like a lead weight in her soul. She sealed the letter in an envelope and addressed it to the editor of the largest newspaper in Philadelphia. The next day, she gave it to a freight driver heading east, along with the last of the coins Eli had given her, and a prayer. Weeks turned into a month. Eli's wound began to heal, the pain receding to a dull ache. He was able to sit up, then to walk, leaning heavily on Clara's shoulder. They would stroll through the small outpost in the evenings, watching the vast, colorful sunsets paint the sky. They spoke of small things, the weather, the taste of the fresh bread the women baked, the progress of his healing. But beneath the surface of their simple conversations, a new and powerful intimacy grew, a bond forged in blood and terror and cemented in the quiet peace of his recovery. He no longer had nightmares of the war, and she no longer woke up screaming. The news arrived on the back of a supply wagon, in the form of a newspaper from St. Louis, weeks old, used as packing material for a crate of tinned goods. As Clara was unpacking the crate, her own face stared up at her from a crudely drawn sketch on the front page. Her heart leaped into her throat. The headline was stark: "Railroad Scandal Exposes White Slavery Ring." Her letter had done more than arrive. It had exploded. The story had been picked up by papers across the country. Her account, detailed and unflinching, had caused a public outcry. Investigations had been launched. Alistair Finch, who had been living a life of quiet luxury in Boston, had vanished, now a hunted fugitive himself. The authorities in Wichita, shamed by the national attention, had raided Silas Black's establishment, only to find it empty, its owner having fled like the rat he was. James Dalton's name had been cleared, his reputation restored. Clara Dalton was no longer the runaway daughter of a thief. She was a heroine, a victim who had spoken truth to power. She was no longer hunted. She was free. She read the article to Eli, her voice shaking with an emotion she could not name. It was relief. It was vindication. It was a profound, earth-shattering sense of justice. When she was finished, he reached out and took her hand, his grip firm and steady. "Your father would be proud." "Clara," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Her newfound freedom, however, brought with it an unforeseen complication. A week later, a polished black buggy, looking entirely out of place among the canvas wagons of the Mennonites, arrived at the outpost. A man in an expensive suit and bowler hat stepped out, a leather briefcase in his hand. He introduced himself as Mr. Abernathy, a representative of the railroad. He found Clara near the chapel and spoke to her with a cloying, corporate sympathy. He expressed the railroad's deepest regrets for the actions of their former employee, Mr. Finch, and for the suffering she had endured. Then, he came to the point of his visit. The railroad was prepared to offer her a substantial financial settlement, a sum that would allow her to live in comfort for the rest of her life. All they asked for in return was her signature on a document promising her future silence on the matter. He laid the document out for her on a tree stump, a long, imposing contract filled with legal jargon. He handed her a fountain pen. "It is the least we can do," he said with a practiced, oily smile, "to help you put this unfortunate business behind you." Clara looked at the man, at his clean, soft hands and his expensive suit. He was a different kind of monster than Cordell, but a monster nonetheless. He was not offering restitution. He was offering a bribe. He wanted to buy her silence, to bury her father's name once more under a pile of money. She thought of Eli, of the sacrifice he had made, of the way he had knelt for her in the mud, offering her respect when she had none for herself. That was a debt no amount of money could ever repay. She took the contract from the stump. She did not read it. She looked Mr. Abernathy directly in the eye, and with a slow, deliberate motion, she tore the paper in half, and then in half again, letting the pieces flutter to the dust at her feet. "My father's name is not for sale," she said, her voice clear and strong. "And neither is mine." She turned and walked away, leaving the man staring in disbelief at the scraps of his worthless offer. But as Clara stepped into the full light of her own strength and integrity, Eli began to retreat into the shadows of his own doubt. He saw her now not as the terrified woman he had found in the cabin, but as Clara Dalton, the respectable, educated daughter of a prominent Philadelphia family. Her name was cleared. She had a future, a life she could reclaim, a world of society and comfort that was entirely foreign to him. And what was he? A drifter, a man who had lost everything, whose only skills were with a rope and a gun. He was a man with a blood debt to his brother still weighing on his soul, a man whose hands were stained with the violence of war and the grim justice of the frontier. He looked at his reflection in a pail of water and saw a scarred, weary cowboy with nothing to offer a woman like her. He was the storm she had passed through, not the harbor she was meant to find. To stay with her, he believed, would be to hold her back. to tether her bright future to his own dark past. He grew quiet, distant. The easy companionship they had found during his recovery was replaced by a strained silence. He began taking his meals alone, finding work to do on the far side of the camp, avoiding her eyes. Clara felt him pulling away, and it terrified her more than Cordell's gun had. One morning, she woke before dawn with a sense of unease. She went to his tent. It was empty. His bedroll was gone. She ran outside, her heart pounding. She saw him by the makeshift corral, saddling Gideon, his brother's horse. The small bundle containing Jacob's remains was tied behind the saddle. He was leaving. "Eli!" she called out, her voice sharp with panic. He stopped, his back to her. He did not turn around. "You are free now, Clara," he said, his voice flat. "You can go home. Live the life you were meant to have." "The life I was meant to have?" she said, walking toward him, her bare feet cold on the damp earth. "My home is a graveyard, and the life I was meant to have was a lie that almost got me killed. I do not want it." "I cannot give you that life," he said, finally turning to face her. His face was a mask of anguish. "I have nothing, no farm, no name. All I have is a box of ashes and a past I cannot outrun." "You deserve better than that. You deserve better than me." Tears streamed down her face, but her voice was strong. "You think what I want is a big house in Philadelphia? You think I want money and a name?" She stepped closer, until she was standing directly in front of him, forcing him to look at her. "Let me tell you what you gave me, Eli Carver. You found me when I was less than nothing, when I was a terrified animal hiding in a shack. And you showed me kindness. You gave me food when I was starving. You knelt for me when I was at my lowest. You made love to me as if I were something precious, not something broken. You gave me back my own body. You gave me back my own choice." She reached up and placed her hand on his chest, over his heart. "You are not my past, Eli. You are the only future I want." He looked down at her, his resolve crumbling in the face of her fierce, unwavering conviction. He saw not pity in her eyes, but love, a love that was as strong and resilient as she was. He finally understood. He was not a stain on her future. He was the foundation of it. He wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her hair, his body shaking with the release of a tension he had carried his entire life. He was, for the first time since the war, home. They bought a small, neglected ranch in a quiet valley 100 miles west, a place with a sturdy little house, a sagging barn, and a creek that ran year-round. It was not much, but it was theirs. They buried Jacob's ashes under a tall cottonwood tree on a hill overlooking the house. Life settled into a new, peaceful rhythm. Eli, with his quiet patience, found he had a gift for gentling wild horses, his reputation for it slowly spreading through the territory. Clara, her love for teaching rekindled, began holding classes for the handful of children from the surrounding ranches in her own front parlor. They worked hard, their days filled with the simple, honest labor of building a life together. The wild, unforgiving West remained just outside their door, but inside their home, the storm had passed. On a quiet morning, cool with the promise of autumn, they lay in bed, the rising sun casting a soft, golden light through the window. Clara was resting against Eli's chest, her head tucked under his chin, his good arm wrapped around her. The silence was comfortable, complete. She tilted her head back to look at him, a soft, playful smile on her lips. She whispered the words that had once been a terrified plea, but were now a cherished refrain, a testament to the journey they had taken. "Promise me you will not hurt me." Eli looked down at her, his gray eyes soft with a love so deep it was bottomless. He leaned down and kissed her forehead. "Never," he replied, his voice a low, sacred vow. "Not even in silence." He settled back against the pillows, his arm tightening around her waist. Clara watched the sunrise, the light spilling over the hills, turning the world new again. She reached up and wrapped her fingers tightly around his, holding on. She was safe. She was loved. She was home. Thank you for listening to this story. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect. And please remember to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.